The MirYam Institute podcast with Benjamin Anthony. Israel's future in Israel's hands.
Okay, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us here at this episode of the MirYam Institute webinar. We're delighted to have you, and whether you're listening live or via the podcast or via the postcast or watching on JBS, we are very, very appreciative of you granting your time and your attention to today's subject, which really is exploring the notion of Iran's proxy forces, Hezbollah and Hamas, and asks the question, what is next for Israel? And we're delighted to have with us David Hacham. I'll introduce David in just a moment. But before I do, I want to begin, as ever I do, by thanking Rosita Panini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute. Thank you, Rosita, for all that you do. And also our colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer. Alan, thank you very much for bringing about this briefing and all other briefings. Now, to talk about this, which we're going to do for about 60 to 75 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, we have David Hacham. David Hacham served for 30 years in various intelligence and political strategic positions within the Israel Defense Forces, including 8 years in the Gaza Strip as an advisor for Arab affairs to successive commanders of the Southern Command and the coordinator of government activities in the territories. He was actively involved in the Oslo peace process and participated in the majority of meetings between Israeli leaders and Yasser Arafat. Following his military service, David Hacham was appointed advisor for Arab affairs to Ministers of Defense Yitzhak Mordechai, Moshe Arens, Ehud Barak, Binyamin Ben Eliezer, Shaul Mofaz, Amir Peretz, and Moshe Bogi Ya'alon. That's 7 ministers of defense that David served as advisor on Arab affairs to. David Hacham is the author of 2 books based upon his experiences. The first is called Gaza in the Eye of the Storm, the inside story of the Intifada, and another book called And the Land Was Filled with Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and his war against Israel. And we're delighted to have you with us, David. Thank you so very much for being with us this evening. Let me begin by asking you, first of all, how are you? How's life? It's been a while since we last spoke.
Yes, it's been a while. You know, we have managed to confront the corona, disease here in Israel. I hope now this is the end of this corona period of time in Israel. And as a matter of fact, during the last period of time, I've published several articles in the auspices of the MirYam Institute in America. And I must tell you that my 3rd book is now in motion. It's going to be published, and it deals about our relations, our security, defense, strategic relations with the Arab Republic of Egypt in the last 30 years, during the period of time of President Mubarak as the president of Egypt, and afterwards Morsi, Mohammed Morsi from the Ikhwan al-Muslimin party, Islamic Brotherhood party, and afterwards with the present president of Egypt, which is Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, whom I know personally from many, many meetings that I used to have with him. So this is a new book of mine, which is going to be published, I hope, in the near future. Besides, everything is as usual, and waiting for your questions and this interview.
Wonderful. Well, I'm very pleased that you've used, and surprisingly, the time very, very constructively. And I want to tell everyone to visit your page on the MirYam Institute, where those articles that you referred to are published, and they're up there, not only at the MirYam Institute, but also at third-party outlets. David, just a quick test. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me clearly and see me clearly?
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Wonderful, yes.
Great. So I'm reminding everybody that this session is called Iran's Proxy Forces, Hezbollah and Hamas, What Next for Israel? Now, when we decided to do this, we did so prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But now we are where we are, and Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the West is demonstrating limited ability to confront, deter, and turn back Vladimir Putin. And obviously, this is a great reduction of complexity. But bottom line, that seems to be as a consequence of the fact that Vladimir Putin's Russia is in possession of nuclear weapons. Now, do you think, David Hacham, that Iran, which is pursuing a nuclear weapon, is watching closely what Russia does and making its decision as to whether or not it is worth its while gaining nuclear weapons capabilities or not, based on how the West responds?
Yes, first of all, you are perfectly right that Iran is following very closely what's going on in this crisis between Russia and Ukraine, looking very much carefully what is the behavior, the attitudes, the policy of the United States of America. And as a matter of fact, not only the United States of America, but the Western world in a whole. And I think this is my assumption, my estimation, that Iran is going to continue with trying, with attempts to, to produce at the end of the day, nuclear military capabilities. Now Iran is with negotiations with the United States of America indirectly and the other superpowers directly in order to come to terms as regard to the nuclear issue with Iran. But I'm saying to you in principle, and this is something we have to take into consideration, into serious consideration, Iran has not abandoned its desire to produce at the end of the day nuclear military capabilities. I think that even the Ukrainian crisis, the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, and the attitude, the policies taken by the West, is another push for Iran to have at the end of the day nuclear military capabilities. And this is something which is totally unacceptable from the Israeli point of view. And this is why I think that the Israeli government, not only this government, but the previous government, when Benjamin Netanyahu was the Israeli prime minister, did its utmost in order to prevent Iran from having nuclear military capabilities. And this is why we had a lot of pressures being exerted by Israel, by the Israeli government, vis-a-vis the international community, basically the United States and the other superpowers, in order to prevent Iran from running towards the atomic bomb. As I've told you before, this is like, I would say, an existential threat from the Israeli point of view, if Iran is going to have at the end of the days nuclear military capabilities. But at the same breath, I must tell you, it's not only a threat against Israel. At the same time, it's against, the free world, the Western world. But when I'm speaking about our area here in the Middle East, it's not less a threat, directed to the moderate, pragmatic Arab regimes, beginning with Egypt, with the Republic of Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, etc., etc. And this is why, by the way, to the shift in the policies of these governments, of these Arab countries towards Israel. In this respect, of course, I'm speaking about the peace treaty signed or the normalization that we have achieved with Bahrain, with the United Arab Emirates, and with Morocco, of course, and I hope with Sudan in the near future.
Well, I hope so too, David, and thank you for giving us that overview and connecting Iran's nuclear ambitions with what we're seeing going on in Ukraine from the Russians. The talk, as I mentioned, is about Iran's proxies, and you have Hezbollah in the north. Let's start there. Give us an overview of Hezbollah's capabilities. It's obviously a natural proxy for Iran. It's a Shiite terrorist organization. And their purpose, primarily, in my opinion, is to act as a deterrent against the state of Israel from launching a strike on Iran's nuclear weapons facilities. That seems to be what their primary use is. They're armed to the teeth, about 150,000 rockets, missiles, projectiles, all aimed towards the state of Israel. A serious fighting force on the ground as well. And of course, new tech capabilities in addition to that, including cyber and including PGM, precision guided munitions, missiles, and so forth. What is the role of Hezbollah in the near future vis-a-vis Iran?
First of all, you are perfectly right with this question. I must add that, first of all, Hezbollah in Lebanon was the first proxy of Iran in the area of the Middle East. And the beginning was at the early 1980s. I mean, the relations between the Arab Republic of the Islamic Republic of Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. What is Hezbollah? Hezbollah is a terror organization operating a political, party in Lebanon. And Hezbollah is behaving or acting as a state within a state in Lebanon. And this is, I would say, the real situation of Hezbollah in Lebanon. You have mentioned before something which is like a common ground for Hezbollah and Iran. Both entities, I mean the Islamic Republic of Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, are Shiite in terms of the streams in Islam, Shiite entities. So this is like a common ground for any cooperation between Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. I must say that Hezbollah in Lebanon, with, you didn't mention, but Hamas in the Palestinian arena, Hezbollah in the north, in the northern part, in the northern borders of Israel, and Hamas in the southern border, in the Gaza Strip, are both two virulent, radical, extreme enemies of the state of Israel. When I'm speaking now about Hezbollah, from the last operation took place in 2006, there is relatively quiet between Israel and Hezbollah in the north. But at the same time, I don't want to mislead the viewers. What happened with Hezbollah in terms of military clashes or military war? This is not the end of the game from the Israeli point of view. I must tell you in this regard, I hear time and again Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, declarations. And you can understand in a very, quick and with no any need for any, interpretation. Hezbollah, under the leadership of Hassan Nasrallah, would like to bring the annihilation of the state of Israel. And this is a very, very dangerous enemy in the north, because you have mentioned in your question, they have today maybe more than 150,000 missiles and rockets. And all of these arsenal of weapons are directed against one enemy in their, vocabulary. And the enemy is Israel. So we have to be very much in alert all the time in order to see that this, danger from the north, this is like a biblical, saying.
Of course, biblical reference.
It's not going to materialize, to be realized in the future. And this is something we are taking, in a very serious consideration when speaking about the Israeli defense and security interests in our borders. This is as regard to Hezbollah. As I've told you, the bottom line is that Israel has to be permanently ready for any, I would say, hostilities, of course, but at the same time for a new war vis-a-vis Hezbollah in Lebanon. We were in the last couple of years on the verge of having like a military confrontation with Hezbollah, and this has to be taken into consideration. Again, I must tell you, we don't need a lot of information, intelligence information, in order to know what are the intentions of Hezbollah vis-a-vis the state of Israel. They are speaking about it loudly, explicitly, overtly. You don't have to make any, trying to understand and to analyze, the desires and the targets of Hezbollah. They are saying it in a very public way. At the end of the day, They would like to see the annihilation of the state of Israel, the extermination of Israel. And this is why they have a common ground, an alliance with the other radical Islamic movements operating in the Palestinian arena. Basically, I'm speaking about Hamas and about Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini, the Islamic Holy War movement, operating first and foremost from Gaza, the Gaza Strip, but not only in Gaza, in the West Bank as well, and having, foreign branches operating in other parts of the Middle East, basically in Lebanon, in Syria, and now in Qatar. I'm speaking about the offices of Hamas in Qatar. And the Al-Jihad al-Islami office, by the way, is still in Damascus. And the new leader of Al-Jihad al-Islami is operating from Damascus. And from time to time, they are making, like meetings with other Islamic radical groups, such as Hamas in Lebanon. Last time it was in Lebanon a couple of weeks ago. By the way, you know that in the last military operation of Israel in Gaza, called the Guardian of the Wall.
Operation Guardian of the Walls.
Yeah, it took place in May 2021, last year. There was a meeting, or there was like a operational room being established of officers from Hamas, Al-Jihad al-Islami, and Hezbollah operating in Beirut. The meetings were taking place in Beirut in order to coordinate all, the operations vis-a-vis the state of Israel, and they did it from Beirut. This is something, of course.
Now, let me pause you there. Let me pause you there, David, because what you've just said is absolutely fascinating. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I first want to ask you some questions, more questions about Hezbollah.
Okay.
The first thing that I want to ask you is this. Right now, we have a situation where the state of Israel, to put it mildly, is treading very, very carefully, diplomatically, with regard to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. One of the reasons is because the state of Israel and the Israel Defense Forces and the Israeli Air Force has a deconfliction agreement with Russia, with Russian forces, that the Israel Air Force, according to foreign sources, can operate in accordance with its best interests over the skies of Syria in order to prevent the funneling and delivery of contraband from Iran across Syria into Lebanon, which would then be trained on Israel by Hezbollah. Exactly. Now, with what is going on in Ukraine right now, do you see a situation where the state of Israel will have to increase its activities over Syria or decrease its activities over Syria in order to prevent Lebanon from getting Iranian contraband? And also, is Israel's red line, that being that Iran will not deliver munitions via Syria, is it such a red line that the Israeli Air Force would tackle Russian troops, Russian munitions, even possibly Russian jets over the skies of Syria in order to enforce that red line?
Listen, you have asked two very, complicated questions, but the answer is...
Well, that's why we have you, David.
Yes.
The answers, that's why we bring you on.
Listen, first of all, I would like to come back to maybe your first question as regard to the implications of the Ukrainian crisis over Israel.
Please.
This is very much important, Benjamin, to emphasize, relating to your present question as well. I've been asked many times, since the beginning of the last crisis in between Russia and Ukraine, what are the implications? What are the lessons that Israel has to learn from what's going on between Russia and Ukraine? And I'll tell you frankly, my answer is very much clear and cut. Israel, first of all, has to continue having a very strong, powerful military units, military army, military. in order to confront not only one enemy, but at the same time to confront a coalition of enemies. And this is what we have seen during the last 70 years, more than 70 years of Israeli independence. We have to have here in the Middle East the strongest military power in the area in order to confront and to prevent any existential threat being, confronted against the state of Israel. This is one thing very much important. Secondly, I must tell you, what the Ukrainian crisis teaches us, it teaches us the importance of the area issue. In this respect, I'm speaking first and foremost about our control of the Golan Heights. We, Israel, has to continue preserving and controlling the Golan Heights against any, I would say, threats stemming from the north. Basically, of course, I'm speaking Syria, and not only Syria. Later on, I'll come to Iran as well. In the same breath, I must tell you, we have to continue preserving the Jordan Valley. Our border with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And this is like a security defense borders from the Israeli point of view. And I'll add to that what's going on inside the Palestinian arena, inside the Palestinian Authority areas. Here in this respect, I must tell you that in any, I would say, deal, any solution, political solution, if now this is most,
any political solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah, which is now irrelevant. I don't see it, in my eyes in the future. It will take time if, years to come in order to come back to negotiations. And we didn't speak about the period of time of Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, which is going to be ended in the future, in the near future. In any case, I'm speaking any entity, political entity in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, must be demilitarized with no weapons, with no army, with no military power in the hands of the Palestinians. And this is something we have to take into consideration. At the same time, I think we have to have an eye vis-a-vis what's going on in the Gaza Strip area. Vis-a-vis Hamas.
Hold on, David. Hold on. We're going to come to the Palestinian arena shortly. Okay. You have my word. But I want to know your thoughts about the question that I asked you. Is Israel's red line with regard to Iran's proxy Hezbollah receiving contraband from Iran via Syria, is our red line, our insistence that we must be able to operate there in order to interdict, detonate and destroy Iranian contraband funneled to Hezbollah via Syria, is it such a red line that we would risk a conflict with Russian personnel who are stationed in Syria, Russian anti-aircraft weapons that are stationed in Syria, and possibly even Russian jets? How much of a threat is this materiel if it gets to the hands of Hezbollah?
This will be a disaster from the Israeli point of view. I'm speaking as a defense, expert in this regard. We have to do our utmost in order, first of all, to prevent the establishing of any Iranian military bases in Iran. We have to confront and to resist the flow of arms, missiles, rockets from Iran to Hezbollah through the Syrian territory. We have to do it in a very careful and cautious way, like we are doing in the last couple of years. You, of course, know that in the last couple of years, our Air Force, in accordance with foreign, sources, are operating in Syria against the Iranian presence. And we are doing it in a sort of coordination with the Russians in Syria in order to prevent ourselves from attacking Russian, interests, so military interests in Syria. And this we are doing in a very sensitive and delicate way through coordination, military coordination between Israel and the Russian military forces. We are doing it in a very, as I've told you before, cautious way, because we don't want to arrive to a point of a military confrontation whatsoever with the Russian military presence in Syria. And in accordance to what's going on right now, even after the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, I can tell you that in accordance to what I've read, in various sources, what I heard from various sources, this coordination is still going on between Israel and Russia. And we are doing our utmost in order not to arrive to a point of confrontation with the Russian forces in Syria. But you are right. I think from the Israeli point of view, the flow of arms, of ammunition, of rockets, of missiles from Iran to Hezbollah, and at the same time, the establishing of military Iranian bases in Syria is a red line from the Israeli point of view, from the Israeli security point of view. This is something that Israel will not tolerate in the future. And this is why I think a red line of discussion and talking must be continued between Israel and Russia in order to explain to the Russians what does it mean to have this kind of military bases, Iranian bases, and the flow of the arms and rockets, etc., to Hezbollah. And I think the Russians will understand, will finally understand. But at the same breath, I must tell you, Benjamin, I was asked time and again during the last period of time about our interests in Syria. I must tell you, because I've heard some kind of a criticism vis-a-vis the Israeli government, saying that in the last crisis in the Ukraine, Israel has not showed its sympathy and support and, in accordance with our alliance with the United States of America. And I had to explain to the people, ask me, I said, Israel has to take the very Russian presence in Syria into consideration. We cannot, close our eyes vis-a-vis the Russian military, presence in Syria, because we have to continue with a kind of coordination as regards to our military attacks against the Iranian bases in Syria. This by no way, by any means, does not mean that we are abandoning something which is very much deeply rooted in the history and the interests of the State of Israel. We are an ally of the United States of America. And this is, we are doing it more than 70 years since the establishing of the State of Israel. We are part of the free world, part of the Western world, and we are in alliance, in a very, strong alliance with the United States of America, and this is going to continue. I think that the Prime Minister Bennett emphasized this point recently in one of his declarations, that the fact that we are in a sort of coordination, military coordination with the Russian forces in Syria, does not in any way mean that we abandon our alliance, our historical alliance with the United States of America, and this must be totally understood.
So I will tell you, David, that I'm potentially a minority voice. I haven't done a poll, either a formal or informal one, but I must share with you, because here at the MirYam Institute, we value an exchange of opinions, including different opinions. I am not convinced that Israel's response is at all as outspoken as it needs to be with regard to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I think that, as I said in a previous webinar that I had, I think that history will not judge Israel well for its response. I think Israel got off to a terrible, stuttering start, trying to find its words and its position on this subject. And I think that diplomatically, not militarily, but diplomatically at least, Israel needed to be far more outspoken, far more condemnatory, far more clear in terms of its criticism, objection, and refusal to legitimize Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine. And I say that, David, because, and you are an expert on Israel, especially when we combat the Palestinian Arabs during times of war, those wars emanating from the Gaza Strip, and also prior to that, as we had to operate extensively in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank during Operation Defensive Shield. Israel, when it faces aggression, calls upon the international community correctly to take a clear moral stand correctly against unjustified aggression against it. And for Israel to now be saying, in my view, we're going to keep quiet because for us it's complicated, for me, that is not the response that I want from the Jewish state. It's not satisfactory to me. And I also will share with you, and feel free to come back at me, feel free to disagree, that's more than welcome. Okay. I also will share with you, David, that I think that there are a number of countries far, far closer in proximity to Russia that also have security and military complications that stem from them criticizing Vladimir Putin. Poland would be one such country. Germany would be another such country.
But
there are many countries that face threats. Israel is not unique for that.
Benjamin.
That's true. That's correct. But I had a webinar before that said, and I invite the viewers to look back at that, David, and I take your point. It's a very important point. They have the security guarantee of NATO. I understand. But I think what we're seeing right now is guarantees perhaps don't mean as much as we'd hope they mean, right? Unfortunately. And I just would like to see, I don't want to make this the purpose of this conversation, but I want to put my view forward on this. I do not feel we are sufficiently condemnatory and sufficiently outspoken. I think we're improving. To be sure, we are improving. The words are getting better. The statements are getting stronger. And the Prime Minister Bennett's willingness to mediate is very, very positive.
Yes.
But I think that we should be more outspoken, David. Your thoughts I welcome, and then I want to move on to Hamas and the Palestinian Authority.
I understand your point of view. Again, I think first of all, Israel in the General Assembly meeting in the United Nations in New York voted against Russia, if you remember. This was like a showing of where Israel is standing in this regard, in this crisis. But you have to understand the Israeli interest and the Israeli point of view. We are not against the West and America. We are against Russia and against the Russian invasion to Ukraine. And this is something we cannot tolerate, as Israel. This is an aggression. And of course, in this regard, we are totally with the Western world when we are speaking against Russia about this invasion to Ukraine. At the same time, I want you not to underestimate the Israeli interest lying in Syria. And Syria is a focal point, is a major point to be taken into consideration. Because in Syria, we are speaking about a crawling attempts by the Iranian to establish its military presence. It means a coalition with Hezbollah, assisting Hezbollah. And this is something we have to take into serious consideration as Israel, and we are speaking about the Israeli security interests. We have to see that this presence is going to be, annihilated in Syria, the Iranian military presence. And this is why we need a free operational activities in Syria in terms of military attacks in Syria against the Iranian presence. At the same time, we need to cut the direction of the arms, missiles, etc., from Iran to Lebanon, to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this is something we are doing it in a sort of coordination with Russia. And I would like to tell you in this respect that I think that even the Americans understand the Israeli position. They understand the Israeli sensitivities, the Israeli, delicate situation in the area. We are not confronting, it's not relations between the United States and Canada. It's Israel vis-a-vis the most extreme, virulent, political, radical entities like Iran, like Hezbollah, like Syria. This is something in this respect, I think that Russia understands as well the Israeli military security interests in this regard. So this is something a little bit complex, but at the same time, I must say it again in order that our audience will understand. We are not shifting our, affiliations or our support from the Western world. We are part of the West. But in this respect, we have to take into consideration the prevailing circumstances, objective circumstances in Syria, and the interest of Israel to have in the future a free operation activities in Syria against Iran and Hezbollah. This is very
But
crucial.
David, let me just respond to that. Let me just respond to that for a moment, and then we're going to come on to the Palestinian Arab aspect of Iran and its proxy forces. But firstly, my concern is not that Israel is moving away its alliance with the West. I'm absolutely certain and sure and confident of our alliance with the West. That's not my concern. My concern is, where is Israel in a moral sense when it comes to overtly, persistently condemning this perceived, so termed and so viewed, and what seems to be unmitigated aggression by Vladimir Putin? That's my concern. And with regard to the red lines, my view is, David, if it's a red line for Israel, for us, that they must not be allowed, Iran must not be allowed to funnel contraband through Syria, then surely you enforce that red line, even when it's difficult to do so. In other words, it's not a pink line, it's not an orange line, it's a red line. And I just don't feel that a red line policy needs to prevent the state of Israel. A red line military policy like the one we're discussing needs to prevent Israel from being more outspoken. And as I say, it's getting better. Israel's response is getting better. I don't want to fail to acknowledge that, but it should not prevent Israel from coming out with a very clear, very, very impactful series of statements and potential actions, not military actions, but actions nonetheless. I personally have not seen that sufficiently. And I can tell you, I spoke to Bogi Ya'alon. For our listeners, Bogi Ya'alon is the former chief of staff and former minister of defense here in the State of Israel. And Bogi expressed to me and to Rosita and to a group of 30 United States Army officers, active officers here in Jerusalem just last week.
Yes.
He said to us very, very clearly that Russia would not dare to have a conflict over the skies of Syria against Israeli pilots. He said that they would come off worse, it would look bad for them, and therefore we should not be fearful of speaking out against the Russian aggression. So I just want to give you that idea, David, and give you that context as well.
This is Bogi Ya'alon, approach and stand. It's not necessarily my
yes, correct.
Regards to what's going on in Syria.
Yes.
Listen, it's like an uneven, equation. Uneven equation. We are speaking about Russia as a superpower, with long presence in Syria, with long, interests in the Middle East. And you are speaking about Israel. Israel is not a superpower. Maybe a superpower in our area in the Middle East in terms of military capabilities. But I think, this is my humble opinion, that Israel should not enter to any sort of a clash or misunderstanding or confrontation with the Russians. This is something I think is a very solid interest that has to be in the eyes of the Israeli government, not to enter to any misunderstanding with Russia. And as long, listen carefully, Benjamin, as long as Russia is giving the way, is giving Israel the opportunity to continue the attacks against the Iranian presence and the Iranian arsenal in Syria and Lebanon, this is something we have to try to continue as much as possible. And this is why I think the Israeli government is not so much in a loud, I would say, stance or positions against the war and against Russia and the war with Ukraine. We are trying to safeguard our interests, to see that our interests are not going to be affected. And I think even the Americans understand the very delicate situation in which Israel is now in the area, vis-a-vis, of course, the war in the Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine.
Well, David, I really do appreciate.
No, but the most important thing is, Benjamin, that our military, attacks in Syria continue, even when Russia is now involved in the war against Ukraine. And this is something we have to see and to continue acting along with the Israeli interests in the area.
David, I always appreciate your perspectives. And by the way, for our listeners, again, you are right to say that's Bogi Ya'alon's viewpoint. It might also be my viewpoint. It does not have to be your viewpoint. And the reality is time will tell who's correct and who's not correct. Yeah. And none of us know what that outcome will be, but I really do appreciate your.
When I was in the Ministry of Defense.
Bogi, yeah, you know him well. And very well. So let's move on to another topic. We have about half an hour left for this conversation. Yes. I want to go back to something that you mentioned in Operation Guardians of the Walls, Israel's most recent defensive operation against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. You said that there was a moked, a headquarters set up in Lebanon, and that it was a collaboration, seems to me like a formal collaboration between Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas. Let me ask you a couple of questions about that. Number one, is that the first time that we've seen that, David, or is that something that frequently occurs? That's my first question about it.
You are speaking about the operation room being established in Beirut.
Yes, the one you mentioned earlier in the call.
Yes, I mentioned beforehand. In May 2021, during the period of time of our military operation in Gaza, the Guardians of the Walls.
Yes.
Listen.
Yes.
When I'm speaking about a combined operational room, Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Jihad al-Islami, and maybe other Palestinian organizations. I think that officially, maybe this is the first time we see a kind of an operational room of these components. But as a matter of fact,
so this is new. This is new.
This is new, but you have to take into consideration that some sort of cooperation between all these elements, these groups, took place before. This is not the first time.
Of course.
And you have to understand that Hezbollah is one of the main supporters of Hamas and Al-Jihad al-Islami in the Gaza Strip. This is like from years. So we have to take it, of course, into consideration. Maybe officially, as you have said before, this is first time that we see some kind of operation room with Hezbollah. By the way, in the same breath, I must tell you that in Gaza, there is a similar operation room with Hamas, Al-Jihad al-Islami, and the other Palestinian organizations, Islamic organizations. So this is something, the relations with Hezbollah are going back into the past. And this is not, of course, the first time that we've seen some kind of, cooperations between Hamas, Al-Jihad al-Islami, and Hezbollah.
So let me ask you, David, in that operation room, You've got Palestinian Islamic Jihad, you've got Hamas, and you've got Hezbollah. Who is in that room? You're an individual who's been very, very close to major players, certainly in the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Who is sitting in that room?
I'll tell you. I have the names, but
yeah,
but I don't want to mention
tell us,
names.
Share it with us.
I'll tell you.
Go on,
listen very carefully. I mean, as you probably know, you of course know, Hamas is located mainly in the Gaza Strip area. It has a branch in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. But at the same time, I was in Gaza when Hamas was established. After a period of time of several years, being located solely in the Gaza Strip area, Hamas opened branches outside the Gaza Strip in the Arab world. And I'm speaking first and foremost about Damascus. I'm speaking about Lebanon, later on about Qatar. So Hamas has people, has activists which are operating outside the Gaza Strip area, now including, of course, in Lebanon. Al-Jihad al-Islami was operating in the Gaza Strip area, but from the beginning, it has an office in Damascus, in which, Al-Jihad al-Islami activists were operating there. By the way, one of the main activists of Al-Jihad al-Islami, the guy who was behind the establishment of Al-Jihad al-Islami movement at the beginning of the 80s, was Fathi Shqaqi. I knew this guy personally.
Yes.
With him several times.
Yes, I know you did.
And
yes.
even, one officer of mine went on thing when we expelled him to Lebanon. He was expelled to Lebanon at the beginning of the first Intifada. And after arriving to Lebanon, he took the lead of Al-Jihad al-Islami outside and, of course, instructed the activities of Al-Jihad al-Islami in the Palestinian territories, basically in the Gaza Strip. By the way, I don't know if you remember, he was killed by Mossad agents in October 1995. I remember
we actually have a webinar of you speaking about that.
Yes, I remember the date because it was 1 month, less than 1 month before the murder of, the said murder of Rabin, of our Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin. He was murdered in November 1995. In any case, this is Fathi Shqaqi. Now,
David, I just want to bring you back because we only have
I'm coming back to it. I want
25.
only to tell you one thing, which is a very important characteristic of the meeting. From the one hand, you have Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Shiite organization. From the other side, you have Hamas and Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini, which are a Sunni organization, a Sunni, a stream in the Islam, Sunni Islam. And despite the fact that there is a gap between Sunnites and Shiites, they are cooperating because the main target, the common target, is of course the State of Israel. And this is why they are meeting together and of course planning all the operations, military operations, terrorist operations against the State of Israel. This is the situation.
David, who are the people in that room? Who are those people? What level are they?
Listen, the people inside this room are activists of both Hamas and Al-Jihad al-Islami, if speaking about the Palestinian side, which are operating not in Gaza or the West Bank, but elsewhere in the Middle East. These are the people.
At what level, though? Activist is a very broad term.
No. The level
bring us more
the
knowledge.
level is like ambassadors, Hamas and Al-Jihad al-Islami in various capitals of the Arab world. In Beirut, in Damascus, they are involved in these meetings, taking place in these meetings. One of them is the guy who is the vice leader of Hamas, the vice in the political bureau of Hamas outside, of Ismail Haniyeh, which from time to time is coming to these kind of meetings. But the meeting that we are speaking about in the last military operation, I mean, the presence in this meeting was of ambassadors, like an ambassador, activists of Hamas and Al Jihad al-Islami abroad, not the leaders.
Okay. So let me ask you a couple of things. And by the way, I apologize for stepping away. It's absolutely freezing where I am, and I went and grabbed my coat, David. So I don't mean to seem so informal, but it's really freezing.
I want to reveal where you are now, but when you are saying freezing, it takes me outside.
It's freezing.
Really?
It's freezing cold. Yeah. So let me ask you something. I don't mean any disrespect to our viewers by throwing on this coat. I hope they won't hold it against me. We've got another few minutes, 20 minutes, David.
Wow.
This program is about Iran's proxies.
Yes.
I want to talk about Hamas.
Yes.
And then I want to talk about Hamas in Gaza, and then the Hamas presence in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. So, basic question for you, David: are we going to see another round of hostilities from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip? Are we heading towards that? I am surprised that they have not yet really tested this coalition. As people know, this Israeli governing coalition is a combination that is very odd in the history of Israeli governing coalitions. It has Arab parties within its composition, and the strength of the coalition surely would be tested, its durability would be tested in the event that there was a round of hostilities from the Gaza Strip. Why is it not being tested? Should we expect another round from Hamas?
Listen, first of all, Benjamin, thank you for this question. I'll tell you why. Don't be misled when you are looking now to Gaza and you see the ceasefire, the Tahdiyah, what is called in the Arab way, going on for the last close to 1 year. As a matter of fact, after the last military operation Israel took in Gaza, there was what we mentioned before, the name
Guardian of the Walls. Guardians of the Walls.
The Guardians of the Walls. Don't be misled. I'm telling you this out of a very good knowledge of what does it mean Hamas, of whom are the leaders behind this Islamic radical organization. And as I've told you before, I was, when Hamas was established, Hamas was established 5 days after the start of the first Intifada. That is to say, at the 14th of December 1987, December 14th, 87, by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the leader of Al-Mujama al-Islami, that used to be the organization before the establishment of Hamas. And I'll tell you frankly, Hamas has not changed its, principles, ideological principles. And at the end of the day, they would like to see the annihilation, the destruction of the state of Israel, and the fulfillment of the Islamic belief, the Islamic dream, which has two phases. The first one, establishing a Palestinian Islamic state on the ruins of the state of Israel in defined borders, min al-Bahr hatta al-Nahr, from the sea, Mediterranean Sea, to the Jordan River. And the second phase is reviving the Islamic Caliphate as it was after the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the four caliphs. I'm speaking about the time of Umayyad house and Abbas house, in which the empire was stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. So don't make any, you have not to be misled, not to live in illusions. This is the ultimate goal of Hamas. At the end of the day, they would like to see the destruction of the state of Israel, of pushing all the Jews to the sea. There is no, any doubt in this regard. This is.
So do you think in the near term, David, we will see another eruption of violence from the Gaza Strip? And if so, when?
Yeah, you are right. Listen, I don't want to say the exact times when this eruption, when these hostilities will take place. But this can be erupted in any minute. You have to bear it in mind. Now, Hamas has an interest, after the last Israeli military operation in Gaza, to reconstruct its, abilities, to reconstruct, the infrastructure, the military infrastructure in Gaza, to have new arms, new ammunition, new rockets, new missiles, etc., in order to pave the way and to be ready to the coming, confrontation with Israel. But again, don't be misled by the quiet that we are witnessing now in Gaza. In any time, this quiet can be ended, and another hostilities can be erupted in the Gaza Strip vis-a-vis the state of Israel. I think that right now what we see, that there is an interest of Hamas after the last military operation to reconstruct all their military abilities. And they have no interest now in waging war against the state of Israel. But this is something we have to take into consideration in the future, that any time hostilities, military clashes can be erupted and can be taken place again vis-a-vis Hamas in the Gaza Strip. This is one thing. At the same time, you asked about Hamas in the West Bank. I must tell you in this regard, in the
David, just let me set the stage for that for a moment. So last week, again, we took 30, as I mentioned earlier, 30 active officers in the United States Army for a helicopter ride to see the strategic depth, or the lack of strategic depth, that the State of Israel has from the Green Line to the Mediterranean Sea. And we looked over villages, towns such as Kalkilia and so forth.
Yes.
If those towns fall into the hands of Hamas, I mean, we are really in a very, very precarious situation here in Israel, aren't we? Given that they're on elevated ground, given the proximity to Israeli towns and cities. But I understand, and you will confirm this, that Hamas's popularity in Judea and Samaria continues to grow.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
The popularity of the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas continues to decrease. What's the future there in the West Bank with regard to Hamas?
No, you said nothing. Listen, in accordance with Hamas strategy, they are not going to be satisfied with the control over the Gaza Strip area. They would like to widen their control to the West Bank, to Judea and Samaria, not only to widen their, influence in Judea and Samaria and popularity among the Palestinian population, but at the same time, to take control over the Palestinian Authority. And not only the Palestinian Authority, but at the same time to take control over the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And now I would like to ask you a very question that I know, of course, the answer. Why Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, a couple of months ago, decided to not to continue with the process of elections to the Palestinian Legislative Council and the president in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip area? And the answer is very much known. He is not less afraid of Hamas taking control of the Palestinian Authority, of the PLO, of the area of the West Bank than Israel. And this is why he decided to postpone. He said to postpone, to delay the elections. But between me and you, this is an act, a final act, not to have a Palestinian elections to the PLC, Palestinian Legislative Council in the West Bank, in fearing of potential Hamas winning a victory in these elections in the West Bank as well. And I think in this regard, and pay attention to what I'm saying, there is a common ground, common interest between the Israeli side and Abu Mazen and Mahmoud Abbas. But unfortunately, Mahmoud Abbas is on the verge of finishing his duty, as we say in the Palestinian arena. He is 86 in this November. He's going to be 86 years old. I see signs of trying to pave the way for his departure from the Palestinian political scene. And right now, there are like 7, 8 people like confronting one another and preparing their camps in order to come to succeed after the time of Abu Mazen is going to be ended. In any case,
how seriously does Iran focus on having Hamas at the helm in the West Bank, David? How important would that be to Iran?
Wow, it will be very much important to Iran. And this is why this is something we are going to resist. By the way, I think at the end of the day, you know, Abu Mazen has today a very minor popularity in the West Bank society, in the population of the West Bank. But Israel has, I don't want to give, you know, any advices to the government of Israel, but we have to take into serious consideration the possibility that after the era of Abu Mazen, and even before, Hamas will try to take more control of the area of the West Bank. And this is something we can see even in the last period of time. I'll tell you in this regard, even more than that. I think that we see now, as you have mentioned before, quiet in our front with Hamas in Gaza. But as if some troubles will erupt in the West Bank, and the confrontation will take place between Israel and Fatah or other people, other organizations in the West Bank, Hamas will be, you know, obliged to join these hostilities and to open another front vis-a-vis the state of Israel in the Gaza Strip area. And this must be taken into very serious consideration in the Israeli side.
David, one other quick question for you. The association between Iran and Hezbollah is understood and clear. They're both part of the same sect of their religious faith. They're both Shiite movements. Tell us why it is that Hamas, which is not a Shiite movement, has such common cause with Iran. How has it come about that Iran is such a patron of Hamas despite the differences religiously?
Yes, the answer is very much cut and clear. They have a common enemy, and the enemy is the Zionist state. The enemy is Israel. This is why they have a kind of alliance. I would like to say in this respect that it was not the same in the last 10, 12 years. There were periods of time of disconnection, of, you know, like rivalry between Hamas and Iran. But in the last couple of years, during the period of time of the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip area, the relations came back to the same level as it was before. And the alliance is going on until now. And the main, I would say, common ground between Iran and Hamas is the their strategy to annihilate, to destruct the state of Israel. And this is something which is bringing these two elements, Iran and Hamas, to a kind of an alliance and to the military support given by Iran. Listen, it's not only military support. Today, the ability of Iran to transfer arms, ammunition, rockets, etc., is very much limited. We have to say the truth. Because you know the Philadelphia line, the 14-kilometer between Egypt and the Gaza Strip are to a large extent being blocked. And they cannot move as they want before, military supplies to Hamas. But I'm speaking at the same time about the financial support. And in accordance, here in this respect, I can rely on American sources, intelligence sources, saying that Iran is supplying in the last couple of years $100 million annually per year to Hamas, to Al-Jihad al-Islami in the Palestinian arena. And this is going to continue in the future, because this is like the common ground connecting Hamas from the one side and Iran from the other side. And don't underestimate.
And this is why that. Sorry, after you finish that thought, David.
Yes, I mentioned beforehand Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini, the Islamic Holy War movement, which is totally, Benjamin, an Iranian military terroristic branch in the Palestinian arena. And the difference between Al-Jihad al-Islami and Hamas is that Hamas, officially, they have two arms, two branches. The armed wing, Izzuddin al-Qassam battalions, Kataib Izzuddin al-Qassam, and they have the political wing at the same time. Al-Jihad al-Islami is a pure terroristic military organization. No, political issues, no political affiliation. At the end of the day, destruction of the state of Israel. This is the main ultimate goal.
No pretense of civility whatsoever. No pretense of civility whatsoever. Now, let me just to your point about Iran. Of course, this $100 million that's being sent, that's one of the issues Israel has with the JCPOA, with the Iran deal, is that it doesn't tackle any of the issues of Iran's funding of non-state actors and terror organizations. It doesn't tackle the ballistic missiles capabilities and development. It doesn't do any of that, which is what makes it so difficult. Last question, David, two parts to it. In the event that Iran's proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, if we were to see a situation where they unleashed the full force of their abilities against Israel simultaneously, together from the north and from the south, is the state of Israel and the Israel Defense Forces ready and willing to counter that militarily? That's question one. And question two, is the IDF ready and willing to counter that? Would it still be willing to counter that in the event that Iran develops and possesses nuclear weapons capability?
Wow, you said nothing, Benjamin. Listen, the first question, the answer is 100% positive. I mean, I was a military man for at least 30 years in the army, and later on, almost 20 years in the Ministry of Defense as an advisor to ministers of defense, etc. And I can tell you, on the basis of our experience in Yom Kippur War in 1973, the war was started in a total surprise for the Israeli side. And where it was ended, 101 kilometers from Cairo and 60 or less kilometers from Damascus. So the answer is totally positive. Israel is preparing itself in terms of military capabilities to confront any enemy and any coalition of enemies. That is to say, in various fronts that Israel is going to confront our enemies in the south and the north and the east, when I'm speaking about Syria. This is number one as regard to the first section of your question. The second issue is regard to what will happen when Iran has a nuclear military capabilities. This is going to change the equation in a very deep, substantial, significant way. And this is why I would say the utmost, strategy, the utmost, target, the goal of Israel is to prevent Iran from having nuclear military capabilities. It's going to change the equation that we now again see in the Middle East between Israel and our enemies. And this is why I think it's number one, I would say, target of Israel to see that Iran won't have in the future military capabilities. And again, in this regard, you maybe know, I only want to mention that in 2010, 2011, Israel, Benjamin, was on the verge of attacking the nuclear military, bases in Iran. This is something which was publicized, everybody knew about it. And I think Israel is taking all the necessary, intentions in the future not to see Iran being nuclearized. This is a substantial, I would say, a threat to the very existence of the state of Israel. And it must be taken into consideration, like Israel did until today.
Well, David, I want to thank you. We've come to the end of our time. I must say you have not been a ray of sunshine on this particular call, David. I appreciate your very realistic viewpoints and considerations. There are a lot of challenges for the state of Israel with regard to Iran's proxies, and I thank you for elucidating those for us. But it's difficult to hear, and it makes for difficult listening, heavy listening. But we're very grateful to you for continuing to educate us. I thank you so very much for putting your perspectives forward with regard to Israel and Ukraine. Your viewpoints are always welcomed and wanted here at the MirYam Institute, and they are the viewpoints of a true expert. And on behalf of everybody who's listening, whether live or postcast or podcast or on JBS, I want to thank you on behalf of me, and also on behalf of Rosita Plini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute. Thank you so very much, David. We are grateful and appreciative as ever. And I look forward to the next time that we speak. And I look forward to publishing your articles from time to time, as regularly and as often as you're willing to submit them to us. Thank you very much, David Hacham, former advisor on Arab affairs to seven ministers of defense for the State of Israel.
I would like to tell you that I'm very thankful to you, and it was my pleasure being interviewed by you in this program, and hope to meet you and to be interviewed with you time and again in the future. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. All the very best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.